agriculture. Sorry about that. So we are so honored to have you, like I mentioned once again, and I bet you are in for a treat. So just to maybe start us off, I would like to know where you're joining us from. I'll start by saying I'm joining from Nairobi, but please feel free to type on the chat and let me know where you're joining us from today. Thank you very much. I can see your responses on the comments. Thank you, Leah, joining us from Nairobi. And we have Mohammed joining from Tunisia. There's people joining from Ghana. We have Emmanuel from Liberia. And we have Joshua from Uganda. Oh my God, and the chat is really lively. So thank you very much. I may not lead everything now, but yeah, thank you, Brazil, Portugal, Dublin, Ireland, Nepal, Canada, Costa Rica, and this is indeed what we envisioned as a network, and we are just about to start. So allow me to introduce our convener, our director, Dr. Joanne Setela, who will take on the program from this moment. Keep them coming. I'll be reading shortly to know where you're joining us from today, but also this will be a very interactive session. So get your keyboards right and we'll start. Karibu, Dr. Johannes.
Good. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Juliet, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for making time to be part of the ARIN International Conference 2022. This is a momentous moment, and we want to appreciate you even as we start, because we know it's December and many people are looking forward to Christmas, and there has been so many meetings from the COP to various engagements. And so your being here is actually an indication of your passion and your commitment to really help or support or contribute to the transformation of not just Africa, but the world as a whole. So I take this opportunity to welcome you, and I'm just going to say a few words before I usher in our keynote speakers to be able to, set the scene. So here we go. The world is on the verge of and amid of several transitions. So this speech is also in your program, the program that has been shared with you. And this is structured by major socio-economic and environmental disruptions, including climate change, COVID-19, and of course, knowledge shifts. Yeah, and some of these disruptions basically, are at the onset, and others are also coming. We don't know when they are likely to come. We didn't know when COVID was going to come. So I think it's important to understand that we are still subject to a number of other phenomena. So as it were, they are all redefining, reimagining, and restructuring lives and the society. And for Africa, these disruptions are redefining new institutional cultures, governance, and decision-making processes with greater implications on the people, and particularly the poor local communities who often face double vulnerabilities, both as victims and as recipients of policy implications around the management of the interruption. So that's very clear. The overall impact of these shifts and disruptions can only be speculated, but largely remains unknown. So this is very important again, that the interruptions that we face as a globe and as a continent are very uncertain. And at the moment, we still do not know the full depth impact of it, and especially for the local community. Maybe for the policymakers, it's very clear that we put some policies in place, and maybe for the researchers, it might be very clear that we've done some research and basically, produce some evidence. But we are still not clear about how the way we react to some of these shocks basically have affected the most vulnerable and the marginalized communities, because these are the once the frontiers, or the people, or the segment of the society who sit at the peripheries of these particular shocks. So, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that such disruptions can occur, painting a stark contrast and disclosing the trade-offs between livelihoods and health, and of course, many other aspects of life. The health and economic systems preparedness and ability to deal with similar challenges were put to test during COVID-19, and simultaneously, the labor market, the economic systems were disrupted, and bringing to light its ingrained inequalities in which vulnerable societies basically exist. Indeed, speaking about the climate change, we just came from the COP27. The IPCC sixth assessment report reveals that while progress has been made in addressing climate vulnerabilities in developing countries, but of course in Africa as well, the outcomes of such efforts are mixed, with certain community groups improving in resilience in terms of their resilience to climate change, while others have been driven to the margins of vulnerabilities. So the question is, as we put in place interventions to be able to help communities adapt to climate change, why is it that some vulnerable communities are becoming worse off? So those are fundamental questions that we must ask collectively, even as we move forward with some of the fundamental decisions that come from the policy spaces. And basically trying to look at this, it is mainly due to the inequalities, of course, in interventions, in policies, funding and misalignment of priorities of different groups. So this is very fundamental to start thinking about how the plight or the profiles of the marginalized are misrepresented in some of the decisions that we take. So the big question therefore is, how can we make the transition just and equitable to ensure that the livelihoods and rights of the poor and marginalized are safeguarded in line with the Sustainable Development Goals? Of course, conceptually, a just transition is an intervention that helps to really strengthen the rights and to be able to create equitable power relations between the different stakeholders that are involved in the different situations that we are talking about. So drawing from this perspective, the Africa Research and Impact Network 2022 International Conference seeks to interrogate pathways through which just transition processes in Africa could rebuild better and more resilient local communities. The conference will focus on three major themes that we have been informed. The first theme is on how do we envision just transition? What does just transition mean to us? What does it entail? The second theme is on how do we build resilient community systems after we understand that just transition is very important for these communities. So how do we put in place interventions that really, are clearly not just mentioning the marginalized, are clearly not using the marginalized or the poor communities as part of the narratives and the process, but ensures that their voices and their plights are well represented. So the third part of the third theme of the conference is on trying to look at, from the spaces where we exist, the policy spaces, the research spaces, the funding spaces, how do we decolonize those spaces in a way that brings in meets or responds to the challenges that the most vulnerable members of the society face. So these are the three themes that we are going to tackle in this particular conference. And I want to believe that we're going to have a very exciting discussion. And just to reinstate that these conversations are very important. I know that people have engaged in many conversations, but these are critical questions that as we continue to talk about them repeatedly, we continue to unveil opportunities for tackling some of the challenges that the world faces to date, but most importantly, consolidating the thought processes, consolidating the voices and the needs of the most vulnerable segments of the community in order to effectively respond to the first fundamental SDG, which is about poverty alleviation. So with those very few remarks, I want to say thank you very much again for being part of this. And I warmly welcome you to the conference. And we do look forward to a very fruitful engagement. Just to mention, the conference already started at 11. We had very passionate side events. One is on translating research into impact, and the other we just ended a few minutes ago was looking at pro-poor energy systems as a way of enhancing also community resilience. So we've got really very exciting discussions in those particular side events that we are leveraging into this particular main event. And with those very few remarks, I want to say karibu sana, and I want to move to the next part of our program. We have a number of keynote speakers. Dr. Chris Kipto from the Ministry of, formerly Ministry of Environment, Kenya, but also now has moved to the Treasury. And also we have Jean Baptiste Avugama, who is the Director of Productive Sectors at the East Africa Community. And we have Ivan Nielsen, who is the head of the P4G activities at State of Green in Denmark. Both Dr. Chris and Mr. Jean are held up in some state functions, but they will be hopefully joining us shortly, or they'll send their remarks to be relayed by their representatives. But we are here, Iva is here, so I want to take the opportunity to invite Iva. So Mr. Iva, again, a quick introduction, and thank you for making time to be part of this. Mr. Iva is representing the State of Green, which is a not-for-profit public-private partnership globally promoting the ambition of Danish energy policy and green technology. So Mr. Iva, you will tell us a bit more. I know you have a very rich CV, but because of time, I want to be able to read all of it. But you are most welcome. You have about 10 minutes to give your keynote speech with regards to the keynote question that was shared with you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry the name is wrong on my introduction here, but my name is Ivar Høj Nielsen. I represent State of Green in Denmark, and you might wonder what Denmark can do for the green transition in Africa, but we try to do our part, and I want to explain a bit about who we are, what we're doing, and how we fit into some of the things that is relevant in an African context. I just want to share my presentation here, if that is possible. Just a second. Okay, that works. Yeah. So State of Green is a special construction. It's a public-private partnership trying to promote some of the thoughts on a national level and on a business level that we have in Denmark, trying to involve the world in the green transition. The thing about Denmark is that we are emitting about 0.1% of the global greenhouse gases. And that is not a lot. And why is it that Denmark has feel that we have something to contribute to the world? And why is it that so many people are looking to us to get inspired by what we're doing? I want to share that with you in the next few minutes. I think that the main thing about Denmark is when we're looking into what we can do to climate change. Since 1990, our economy has grown by more than 60% in Denmark. And normally you say that if you need growth in society, then you need to use more energy. But we have managed to grow our economy by 60% without using more energy. So in that respect, we are leading in the green transition and try to inspire the rest of the world by what we're doing. At the same time, we brought down our water consumption by 40% over the last 30 years. So we are very conscious about how we use our resources, and we think that consciousness is something that we want to share with the world, and hopefully the rest of the world can be inspired by what we are doing. I hope you're hearing me. Is that okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, there's somebody else. Okay. First of all, State of Green is a public-private partnership. And that is one of the key things that I think the world can look at, both in the green transition, but also in a just transition context. We have 4 ministries as our owners and 3 business organizations, and working closely together with business, but also with some trade unions, because the trade unions see the green transition as really important, but also see that a just transition is a very important part of this. So when you want to make the green transition across the world, you need to look at a just transition at the same time. Do we exclude some people from the labor market by making the green transition, or do we not? And how can we prevent people getting lost in the labor market with the green transition? Very fast, we are a not-for-profit organization, public-private partnership, and we facilitate relations between international stakeholders and match those with partners in other countries and between Denmark and the rest of the world. And what we want is to tell what we are doing and tell the world, we have done it this way. Can you be inspired in your country to do something similar with the means and the resources that you have in your society? And we have a website where all our technological solutions are visible. But what we want to do is to connect and show that. So we have lots of people coming to Denmark, 200 delegations coming every year, and we are represented at events around the world all the time. But what we do is that we are a country with lots of technological solutions. And we think that if you want to make a transition in the world and change the world, then you need to have policy and technology moving together. The world is moving fast. We are getting more and more people across the world, not least in Africa. And to help that problem and that challenge that more people is, then you need growth. And to get growth in a right way, you need cooperation between the public sector, other sectors as well, the civil society, universities and research institutions, municipalities, but also the private sector with the technologies that are available. So in Denmark, we decided that we will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2030. That is a lot, and that is very much to do. So the important thing here is that we have a broad political support for that. It is needed to have the political support for the green transition. But it is also important to involve all other sectors as well. Politicians are important, but other sectors are equally important, because this is a common responsibility for all of us. across nations, across the world. In our country, we didn't know how to, or I just want to say that we see green business as an important thing to move forward with. So we have a lot of focus on involving the private sector in it. And we can see that there is business opportunity in this. So business opportunity is also something that is good for the whole of society to get the growth which will benefit the whole society. And that means that the growth must be relevant also for all kinds or all parts of society, including the poorer people. So, and that is a special responsibility also for governments to include the poorer people in this. And that is just to show this, that how can you make a green transition and make it just? You must involve all, you must find the money, you must have a broad political agreements on this, so all political parties can see that this is something they must support. You must set up partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. You must have collaboration across society between all sectors, because the challenge of climate change is so enormous that everybody must work together on this, both on national level and on international level. So research and development is also an important part of this. Otherwise, you won't find the new solutions that will bring us in goal with this. And that is all part of the green transition, but the just transition is equally important. You must make sure that you don't lose parts of society in this process. And that is something that is really important in the approach that we have from Danish side, also in our development policy as a state. But how do we do it on a global basis? From our small country, where we only emit 0.1% of the global emissions. Well, we think that climate partnerships is important. When our government decided to bring down energy emissions, climate emissions by 70% by 2030, the government didn't know how to get in goal. So they asked the private sector to be involved in this and asked, how on earth do we get in goal with this? So they set up climate partnerships where CEOs of the private sector were heading these partnerships. And the climate partnerships worked for several months very hard and came back and concluded, yes, it is possible to get in goal and get to the 70% reductions by 2030, which is only in 8 years' time. And they came up with 400 different recommendations on how to reach the goal. And the important thing here is to say that the public sector and the government cannot do this without involving other sectors of society. In our country, the last election, climate was the most important thing also for voters in our society. So this is a common cause for the whole society. And the important thing really for any society in the world is to have involvement. And when you have the involvement of all sectors of society, not least civil society, then you have the opportunity and the chance of getting in goal with this and the support from the people. And that is also the key and the fundamental part and building stone for a just transition in any country in the world. So engagement, innovation, acceleration, and co-creation are key words to get in goal with the fight against climate change, but also for a just transition. Very short. One thing is what we've done in Denmark and how we want to inspire the world by what we're doing. No other country in the world can do it the same way as we've done in Denmark, because our country is special compared to all other countries. But what we can do is that our government has set up government-to-government programs with a lot of countries around the world to inspire them by some of the things that we've been successful with in our country. So lots of engagement between our governments to tell how can we make this transition in the world, and how can we do it in a way that is to the benefit of the whole society in each country. And that is not easy. It's definitely something you have to discuss, but you have to educate people, you have to involve people to see that it's actually possible to do this and reach the SDGs and reach the climate goals that the United Nations have set in the Paris Agreement from 2015. So the last thing I just want to say here is that one thing that the State of Green and Denmark is involved in is the P4G. That is what I'm working with normally. P4G means Partnering for Green Growth and the Global Goals 2030. 12 countries are involved in this. And the important thing is that this is something that must be implemented in the emerging markets that are part of P4G. In Africa, it's Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa. And what we can do is to look at how can we create partnerships across borders, across sectors, across companies, across organizations, to the benefit of each country. From Danish side and from European side, we can bring in technologies. We have lots of technologies that are very good and can be of benefit in each country. But it's not just bringing in technologies, it's about doing it in a way where it's to the benefit of the country. So it fits into the national plans and the ambitions of the nation within energy, water, agriculture, the development of sustainable cities or circular economy. But it's also important here that if we bring in technologies, it must be in a way where we can see that it will create jobs, it will create local business on a business level. So the success of this partnership will continue after the financial support from the beginning will stop. And the ambition is that these partnerships will continue, create lots of jobs in the country, create what I would call a part of a just transition, because you need growth in your country to help all parts of society. If you don't do that, we will be in trouble. So it's important to have a growth in the right way, but also to have a growth that will involve and be the benefit for the whole country. Just one thing that I want to mention, I don't know how much time I have, but just to mention one thing is that in Ethiopia, we're trying to help with a very simple thing, but also a very important thing. The poor people in Ethiopia eat biscuits to feel that they get a full stomach. But the problem is that many of these biscuits do not have enough nutrition. So what we want to do is to create a local production of biscuits with lots of proteins, so to help the poor people be able to afford buying biscuits with enough nutrition to get a better life than they had originally. Other things we are looking into is a better cold chain in society to bring the food and to strengthen the communities out in the countryside. But there are lots of projects going on, but most of all, the important message from here is involve all parts of society in this, because this is important to have the transition, to get the growth, but also to involve all parts of society. So the growth will be to the benefit for everybody. Thank you. I think I've used my time and perhaps a little more. I'm sorry about that part.
Thank you, Ivar. Indeed, you have effectively used your time. 4 key principles, fundamentals of just transition, and of course, in the context of green transition, co-creation, innovation, engagement, and yeah, so these are key, and I think that message is very clear in terms of moving forward and trying to contextualize these debates from the international, conceptual sphere to the African context. Allow me to, before I bring in our very fiery and very insightful panelists, allow me to, continue setting the scene by inviting, 2 speakers who are going to, present to us, some of the aspects or some of the perspectives around why, just transition is very important for Africa. And this is going to happen in the context of a book that we've just released through ARIN, titled Africa's Right to Develop in a Carbon-Constrained World. So ladies and gentlemen, allow me to bring in Dr. Kennedy Mbeva, who is a strategic advisor to ARIN, but also a postdoc at the University of Oxford, but also Dr. Ruben Makomere, who is a legal advisor at ARIN, but also a doctoral researcher at the University of Tasmania in Australia. So welcome, Kennedy and Ruben. You have 10 minutes. I don't know how you're going to share that. As they put up their slides, I want to request participants that if you have questions or comments that you'd want to put across, please put them on the chat already. We are gathering them already, and we will at one point bring them to the fore. Kennedy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. And I think I'd agreed with Ruben that he'd go first and then I'd go after him. So I deal the floor to Ruben and then I'll go after him.
All right, so Ruben.
Yes, good morning, good evening. I don't know which part of the world you're at, but good night if you're like me over here. It's wonderful to be here today with all of you, distinguished panelists, speakers, and also participants in this conference. Indeed, it's a very important conversation that we're having. And I'm glad and I'm privileged to be part of this conversation. So thank you very much for accommodating me today. And without further ado, I'll just get on to it. So just as been said by the previous speakers, indeed, we're having a situation in Africa where we have to start figuring out how we're balancing between different interests, different goals and priorities. And the concept of just transition is obviously an important sort of normative concept that is gaining traction in the climate governance space. And in Africa particularly, it has a lot of resonance because, of course, we are trying to also tackle developmental concerns at the same time, balance that out with sort of, regional and global climate ambition. So I'm just going to try to be as brief as I can. So I'm just going to have 3 key messages to just build on what has been said before. So number 1, obviously, we have Africa's developmental sort of landscape occurring amid massive, unique transformational change. This is very important because it sets the context of what Africa really has to deal with. And as I'll discuss shortly, this has quite some implications into how we imagine just transition and how it applies in the context of in the African context, and also emerging other developing countries, I think this might be relevant. I'm going to start with the just recently concluded COP27. Obviously, like I said, just transition is this sort of normative concept that is gaining traction in climate governance over the recent past. We see it in formal recognition of the COP27 decision. Although it's mainly discussed in the context of, achieving transition to clean renewable energy and broader mitigation goals. And so the decision importantly establishes the work program on just transition to sort of try to achieve Article 2 of the, to find pathways of achieving Article 2 of the Paris Agreement and just incorporating just transition into that. And there's also a call to parties that they increase their sort of flows into developing countries to help them sort of achieve these goals. And of course, as we know, COP decisions are non-binding, but at the same time, they have that persuasive element, the way they can catalyze a lot of other actions at different scales. But what's also important to remember is also that it's very important that this issue is now out there because it can sort of create that opportunity structure to start engaging with some of these this particular concept. And for Africa, it's important because Africa is not just looking at development. We normally talk about development in Africa. We don't just talk about it in terms of what happens on the continent. There's also a lot of ambitions occurring on the Africa's marine space. And we know if we're talking about climate impact, oftentimes we focus on the terrestrial aspects of it, but we don't also look at the marine aspects of it. And we are seeing a lot of policy frameworks around development, both blue economy and sort of green economy and so on, clean energy. And we've seen some landmark policy frameworks. Just do that, sorry. Yes, we've seen some landmark policy frameworks, Blue Economy Strategy, Agenda 2063, and so on. So this basically just highlights the breadth and the scope of what we're talking about in terms of what Africa is trying to do from a developmental perspective. And we can see some of the stakes. Again, I focus on blue economy, but I think the broader message can apply to other areas as well. So there's a huge aspect of job creation, there's a huge aspect of income generation, food security, and so on. This is also an issue that cuts across to other issue areas. But of course, we are looking at transformational change. This is where now it starts to get really interesting from an African perspective. We're looking at, for example, one of the main issues that we're going to have to manage is demographic change, which is not just massive, but also rapid, right? 2050 is just a generation away, really. So if we're looking at having almost double the population in the continent, then that has some serious implication in terms of future planning and forecast horizon planning and so on. Not just in realizing development, but also thinking about how we navigate climate action. And of course, again, focusing on the Africa's marine space, we are looking at some really important climate-induced changes. And this is also important because normally this conversation, if you look at African policymaking, is not really captured a lot, but it kind of paints the picture of the kind of dilemmas that we're facing and that we'll have to think about when we think about just transition. For example, there's a study that came out this year in the well-recognized Nature publication, which showed that we might lose the entire coral reef system on the Western Indian Ocean. So that is the East African seaboard going all the way down to South Africa. That might go in the next 50 years. And so if we're going to think about how do we then develop and incorporate things like blue economy and start to harness some of these resources, it really starts to paint a very interesting picture because we're going to have to really think long and hard as to how we can achieve both sustainable growth, development, but also we also need to do something really, really serious. We need to start really looking at our climate policy and figure out creative ways of navigating this space. And that brings three issues really for us, and that is uncertainty, cost, and the increased complexity of how we approach climate and development. And so these are some of the dilemmas that really animate this kind of discussion. And we now have to start thinking about, okay, what does just transition really mean for the continent? How do we achieve it? What are some of the trade-offs that we're going to have to deal with? And so there are no quick fixes for this. The policy efforts, whether you're talking about achieving a blue economy, as my focus for this particular discussion is, or other aspects of development, we're going to have to really start to rethink how we approach this. It cannot be the same or sort of business as usual model, because the dynamics we're facing are quite different. And this actually opens up an interesting opportunity for new research. And this is what really the book kind of brings out, this whole interesting perspective as to what just transition, the implications of just transition in an African perspective, an African context, and the kind of questions that we're in. So it's a very interesting dive into resetting and reframing the table in terms of how we approach this kind of emerging concepts. What do they mean? The COP decision, for example, is not very clear on some of these questions. And of course, there's a global perspective to it, but now we have to really look at it from an African perspective and look at some of these dilemmas that we are going to have to deal with. And so once again, it's an interesting opportunity for us to really come in, and ARIN obviously is kind of helping us to chart this path, and to look at what kind of ideas that can come out of engaging this very interesting topic. So on that note, I know focused on blue economy a lot, but the lessons I think cut across disciplines. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Kennedy to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ruben. And I think could I request that you pull up the slide on the book, because I'll be speaking on that. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Sure. Let me just share it.
Great. Yeah. So I think I'll be building on the conversation, a very interesting conversation by Ruben, and I'll be making 5 points just to elaborate on some of the issues that are coming. And I think the theme of the conference is very timely in the sense that we're just from COP27, and many people argue that it will be, or rather speculated that it will be an African COP. But then, that begs the question of what exactly is an African COP? From our point of view, I would think the factor development dimension of climate change really came out very strongly with the establishment of the funding mechanism for loss and damage, and also start commencing work on just transition work program is very important in this sense. So I'll try to give a broader perspective as Ruben has alluded to, because Ruben gave us a very nice sort of a big picture view of some of the big sort of trends we should think about in the continent in a longer term. The earlier presentations really gave us some granular aspects of what just transition would look like in practice, and at a very granular level. I'll take us all back again to the continental level, but also not look at Africa as a continent, but also how we look at the world from Africa. And I think that'll set sort of a broader context as well for the other presentations that'll be coming after. So I think I'll make 5 quick points. The first one is the development aspects of climate change. This is a point that has been made so many times by African policymakers and diplomats and those from the global south for many decades. since the 70s, when we had, the first 1972, the first conference on environment and development. These ideas are not new, but they're quite old. What is new, perhaps, is we are seeing these ideas come to life. And we are actually seeing actual sort of tensions in trying to reconcile our right to development, but also engaging in ambitious climate action. So it's not a hypothetical issue, it's a very practical issue. So I think, which leads to the second point that was alluded to by Ruben in his presentation, where we cannot think of climate change outside of the development or socioeconomic context. And I think for those who've gone through the conference program, that is a theme that is recurring very, very strongly. And the different panels will explore how that looks in practice. But I think the key point is that we cannot talk about climate policy without the development context. Almost all NDCs, that is nationally determined contributions submitted by African governments to under the Paris Agreement, include a sustainable development context. So there's that sort of aspect that is very, very strong. Perhaps what is challenging in the coming decades, in the coming years and decades, is how that could happen in practice. And for those who are following the debates, for example, in the last few years, there was a huge debate which is still going on whether Africa should exploit its fossil fuel reserves. And many African countries are discovering them. And, of course, Africa has contributed only 3% to greenhouse gas emissions. But also Africa is very much reliant on, for example, financing to develop fossil fuel energy projects from overseas. And the push, for example, to ban financing on fossil fuel projects has direct impacts on the continent's development policy. So these are not hypothetical issues, but they really sort of go to the heart of development. And I think for those kinds of trends we outline in the book, of course, we do discuss those that there's already a policy response, but we also discuss trends that are not yet apparent as of now, but will become a very big issue going forward. And just to highlight one of them is a lot of investment is going into infrastructure projects in the continent, billions and billions of dollars. But then part of that, many of those sort of investments are protected by the investment regime, where if, for example, governments introduce regulations on climate grounds, they might be sued in private tribunals in different parts of the world, and they might be forced to pay billions of dollars. We can already see that happening in Europe, and where European countries are thinking of pulling out from the Energy Charter because they're really posing a lot of risk to the investment, but also their sovereignty. So as we sort of take in more and more investments in Africa, are we thinking about having insurance policies so that we don't get sued and have to pay back billions of dollars, which, for a continent where we need more investment for development, that will be really catastrophic. But we do not have a comprehensive policy response to such a sort of policy development in the continent. So we do outline many other kinds of policy developments in the book, where I think some more thinking really need to go into to make sure that we safeguard our development policy. So quickly, and I think related is the third point of capability. Now, Africa has no shortage of policies. We have numerous policies at the national level, NDC, the various climate action plans, at the regional levels through the various regional economic communities, but also at the continental level. But then the two challenges, one is a perennial challenge of capability of translating those policies into action. And capacity has always been a big challenge for various reasons, because policymakers face numerous challenges, not just one. And sort of trying to really implement the policies fully has been a challenge. And I think many partners have always supported that. But I think another kind of challenge in terms of capacity and capability is on connecting the dots. And as the sort of previous presentations alluded to, and also the panels that will be forthcoming sort of will really unpack in detail, sort of a comprehensive policy responses that connect the socioeconomic and the climate elements are indispensable. So we need a kind of capacity as researchers or policymakers to connect the dots, but also formulate responses that really cut across all those various themes. So as I wrap up, I'll combine my two penultimate points in terms of going ahead or thinking ahead. I think one of the final points, or rather what we really need to flesh out now, given especially the trends highlighted by Ruben, is the need for long-term planning in the continent. We have our African Union Agenda 23, but also there's the competing sort of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that are supposed to be implemented by 2030. So how do we reconcile those two? How do we allocate resources to implement those long-term visions? And how do we keep refining our policy approaches as we try to implement our long-term visions? So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll hand the floor back to Dr. Atela. Thank you very much for your
Thank you,
attention.
Dr. Kennedy and Dr. Makomere. Well taken. Africa's future has a very complex socioeconomic situation, and that might implicate the way we respond to climate change. So there are major questions that you have raised there, and I hope the panelists will be able to respond to them. Julia, do you have any burning question before I bring in our panelists that either the keynote speaker or the two presenters would respond to? Julia.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Atela. And just before I check out the questions, I think our previous keynote speaker and the two book discussants, Dr. Kennedy and Dr. Ruben, have really highlighted pertinent issues. And probably just to mention what comes into my mind when we talk about Denmark is they were the first country to kind of give their commitment to pay up for loss and damage, which is a really positive thing. So thank you very much, Dr. Iva, also for your very important points. And Dr. Kennedy's point that is a take-home for me is the need for long-term planning in the continent of Africa. But as you can see, the conversation is really lively on the chat. And I'm just gonna invite Linda and Sifuli, if you'd like to kindly unmute yourself and ask your question. But if you're unable to, please let me know and I'll go ahead and read it out. Linda Nisful. All right, I think Linda is unable to unmute, but this question was directed to the keynote speaker, and she's asking, please, I would like to know if State of Green has guidelines for establishing these climate partnerships, and are there any criteria that have been used, that have been made of use that can be useful within the African context? And moving forward, there's also another question from Victoria Zozi. Victoria, are you able to unmute yourself?
Well, Victoria Source is me.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to answer the questions in the chat, if that's okay. But if you want me to answer it here as well, up to you.
Yes, that's absolutely okay. And sorry about that. But there's a comment from Paulo Sogo, who is saying climate diplomacy is a practice of managing negotiations under the current international climate regime and can be incorporated to help guide the discussion on climate change and a just transition. There's a question from Esinam Atipo. Would you like to unmute yourself? Esinam from Ghana.
I think you can just go ahead and read it. No problem. Thank you.
All right. So what is Denmark's strategy in bringing about the required behavioral change in the general population in its attempt to align the behavior of its people with the just transition concept?
It's very interesting because I think that the political world communicates a lot about this. So the public is conscious about this, but it's also something that comes from the people. The last election we had in Denmark, climate was the most important part for the public. And the politicians started discussing climate on a higher level because the public wanted them to. and that so it's a two-way involvement, both from the people but also from the politicians. And I think that we've had 50 years where the people or the pupils at school have been taught about the environment and the need to feel responsible for the environment and for climate. So there's a very much for the educational system to take responsibility for this and learn new generations about what is necessary here. Why is it important that we take care of this? And we're in a position where we have lots of water, but in an African context, I think that everybody is more conscious about the value of water. But what we've done in Denmark, and what is something that helps the people to understand how important this is that we are taxing energy, we are taxing water. So we pay a lot of money to have wastewater handling and get clean water in our houses. I think that is a process where Africa, it's really a challenge in Africa, because water is something where you think water is something that is everybody's right. And in a way, it is everybody's right, but you have to know that it's a value. And what we've done is that we put a value on water. So you have to pay for the water. And that is, in a just transition context, for my part, also a challenge, because the poor people need water, but can they afford the water? And that is the issue. How can you find a system where you make sure that everybody get the water and the clean water they need, and at the same time can afford it? And that is, well, again, that's where politicians must come in and help create a system that can solve that problem.
Thank you, Ivar. And Johnny says, many thanks for an inspiring presentation, Ivar. With respect to partnership frameworks, I'd be interested in hearing what kinds of feedback have you received so far from the Global South partners? And I'm being mindful, but especially if you can share the community of any concerns or critical feedback, such thoughts would be very interesting. Maybe I can take 2 more questions and then you can respond to 3 at a go, if that's fine.
That's okay.
We can limit, because some are already responded to, Juliet, and in the interest of time, because we have our panelists coming up. So let's, yeah, maybe we have one burning one that you think is important.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, please. Let me answer this question then. I think the feedback, when we talk with governments in countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, South Africa, Tanzania, and I think that the climate and the involvement of all parts of society is something that is fascinating everybody. The question for everybody is, how can we do this? When you see it in an African context, this is perhaps seems very strange that you can make a climate partnership between the public sector and the private sector. But I can assure you that it's not just Africa, it's much of the world where they feel that cooperation between the public sector and the private sector is very difficult, and it can be difficult to find the trust between the sectors. And there's some skepticism because the different sectors speak different languages, and sometimes when they say something, they mean something different. And it's the same with NGOs and with the universities, for that matter. But I think that the understanding of the necessity of sectors to cooperate to reach the goals and get benefits from working together, that necessity is something that lesson must be learned. And I think when we talk to countries in, that's both private organizations and governments in Africa, I think they're fascinated by this. And when they have heard us talk about this, I think they go back and think, well, how are we going to do this? And there's still a step when you hear about it and say, okay, this sounds interesting, and to actually do it in practice. And I think that step is something where we can try to help, and through discussions like this one, help bring this process further ahead. I think that sooner or later we'll get there, but development and change take time, we all know that. But on the other hand, we have to talk about it, and we have to push for that transition to take place as well. And I think it's really important for just transition as well. Point taken from me.
Thank you. Very spot on, and key. Of course, we might not get solutions that we need here, but as we continue to have these conversations, some of these experiences should be very critical. I want us to bring this a bit more home, just to understand. There are still a number of questions, so Juliet is picking them, so we still respond to them. But I want us to go into the panel discussion, where we try now to see what is the actual situation in Africa, and what does the COP, so the COP27 that we just came from, mean for us. So I have 4 panelists who are going to speak to us. I think there are 5, but I think one is not there. So we have Dr. Eunice ARIN, who is the Global Policy and Advocacy Lead at ICLEI. And we have Dr. Amanda Maki, which is the Director of Knowledge and Learning NDC Partnership. We do have Professor Nicholas Misinki, who is also studying the political economy of environmental governance, and is based at the University of Maine. And finally, we have our own Dr. Mithika Mwendwa, who is the founder of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA, and also one of the leading voices for just transition in Africa. So the first panelist I want to bring on board is Amanda, Dr. Amanda Maki, who is the Director of Knowledge and Learning at the NDC Partnership. So Amanda, we are talking about just transition, for Africa. And I know you interact a lot with NDC documents, and these are some of the issues that are being raised in these documents. What in your opinion does just transition, mean for Africa? What is the picture of a just transition in an African context, and of course as represented in some of the NDCs? How can we measure that this kind of action, intervention, funding, or whatever is really a just, linking or responding to a just transition? Your 5 minutes to speak to that, but because we'll come back to you, later on that question. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation to join today's conference. It's been really insightful to hear the previous interventions. So I'm happy to share some perspective from across the NDC Partnerships Network. And we're a global coalition of over 200 countries and institutions helping to drive forward implementation, enhancement, and financing of NDC action and sustainable development. So on the question of just transition, I don't think there's an easy answer, and we've touched on this already in some of the earlier interventions, but what we've seen is that just transition really needs to be defined independently by each country. And what's really critical to that is that it's done through a whole of society or a whole of government approach. And this is really a core element of the NDC Partnership's country-driven model. So to give you an example or a broad trend, out of the 80 developing countries that we're currently engaged in and supporting, we've received nearly 5,500 individual requests for support around their NDC. And out of these requests, nearly a third of these touch on some sort of element of civil society, equality, human rights, gender equality, rural development, youth engagement, disaster risk reduction, job creation. So the various elements that make up what it is that a just transition can mean for a country. So I wanted to start by just pinpointing or really underlining the fact that this is something that we're seeing countries really think through and take seriously and integrate into the request for support that they're making internationally to partners as they implement their NDC. When we look at measuring and monitoring what a just transition is, the ideal scenario would actually be that the MRV frameworks and the reporting processes in a country should be used to capture the social elements for climate action. So building on the last point that I made, really ensuring that communities and people that will be the ultimate beneficiaries of ambitious climate goals that facilitate a just transition are part of the ways that countries are measuring their success. This is also critical because it ensures that the people and communities most vulnerable to the changing economy and structures are really integrated into the solutions and are prioritized in the actions. One of the things that we're doing specifically on gender, for instance, is that we're supporting countries to really ensure that the indicators and the tracking processes that they use reflect concerns to enable them to measure gender equality and enable them to ensure that the right stakeholders are involved at the right time. So integrating it throughout that whole planning process. The last thing that I'll mention here, and I can come back to more of this on the second round, is that there's lots of tools that are available out there as well. So we have a knowledge portal on our website where we bring together the different tools and resources that partners have put together. And there's a huge number of tools specifically for countries to build social equity into their climate action plans and tracking frameworks. There's a lot of resources to use to build off of that. We did a quick search before this event and we found 13 tools alone just on developing socially inclusive indicators and on just transitions. So I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing from the other panelists and coming back to share some further insights shortly.
Thank you, Amanda. Key points: just transition is context specific, and the need to develop matrices or metrics that is able to speak to this element of just transition. As we've heard from the previous speakers, just transition is a great word, is important, but still a relatively broad, abstract. So we need to develop matrices to be able to clearly define that in Africa. And you've also noted that the NDCs are very clear and focused on social issues to the extent that the elements of just transition remain very important in that. Allow me at this time to bring in, I don't know, Mithika is here, and I want to connect this discussion a bit to the COP27 so that we can be able to get some practical perspectives. The question I have for you, Mithika, and you've led a lot of justice calls, so climate justice pursuit for African communities in the international platform. So we commend you for that. But following on the just concluded COP27, what are some of the key elements or the key outcomes? Okay, somebody's muting me as I speak. Yeah, what are some of the key elements that could be relevant to the just transition discussion in Africa? Some of the key outcomes of COP27 that are relevant to the just transition discussion in Africa. I know there's loss and damage, and you can touch on that as well. Mithika, if you're there, the floor is yours.
Dr. Mithika is not here anymore. He dropped out.
Oh, he's dropped out. Okay. So hopefully we'll rejoin to be able to speak to that as well. Yeah, but again, let me just reflect on the same question and bring in Nicholas Misinki. I don't know, Nicholas, are you here? All right. So Nicholas, could you reflect on this question? You are the COP. We met, we had a discussion. You are very passionate about some of these issues. What are some of the outcomes that are relevant to just transition? And I know you do your work a lot in Africa, so could try to connect that to the African context and also reflect a bit on the loss and damage issue.
Sure. Thank you everyone for the invitation, and thank you for this really wonderful conference. I think the issues being discussed are exactly what need to be discussed both here and at COP27. There are a couple of relevant issues to the just transition from COP. I mean, the discussions around loss and damage were key, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, I think, in our next conversation. But the big question, I think, on the table was it was an African COP and trying to address African issues. So much of it was about climate adaptation and prioritizing adaptation and implementation. Although in practice, that turned out to be a discussion of climate finance and who's going to pay for much of this transition. Now, there were lots of discussions about leveraging private sector, about reforming the multilateral development banks, and even sort of how to increase the amount of funding that the current climate funds actually have. When we have this big number of 100 billion in climate adaptation funding by year 2020, well, that number was missed over the last few years. It still hasn't been met. And so even though we're creating new funds to have a just transition and be part of this, this movement, they need to meet the actual funding commitments that were already put in place. Just to highlight a few points that I think I pulled up from the COP27 when I was there, a big priority is about reforming the multilateral development banks. And in order to have a just transition, it means that the multilateral development banks aren't just using their funding for climate adaptation in the global north, but actually making this accessible and just for the global south. And this is particularly relevant in Africa, where the amount and cost for development funding is much higher than in the global north, specifically from these development banks. So I think many of you probably heard about the Bridgetown Initiative. If you haven't watched this speech by the Prime Ministers of Barbados, you definitely should. She called for many things, some of them meaning to leverage the special drawing rights of the IMF for climate adaptation. Others, things like trying to get all of development funding to be related to climatization, trying to make everything about climate. And also to ensure that private investment in climate action is easier to ensure in the LDC countries. All of that, I think, is on the radar. It wasn't achieved at COP27. What I did hear, some of the conversations were about sort of the actual climate funds that are in existence. So we have the Clean Development Mechanism, we have the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. There, some of the top recipients of the funds are African countries. So South Africa, Egypt, Kenya, and Morocco are some of the top recipients. But we still have major barriers to receiving that funding. So the accreditation process was discussed about how to make the accreditation process and like disbursement of funds more streamlined. Many countries are having long delays in the reaccreditation process, and dispersal of funds are taking years and years when we just don't have those years. So, I mean, the big question is about the loss and damage fund. And here, even though loss and damage was discussed for the first time at COP, it was officially on the agenda, and the big progress was that they decided to create a fund. There is no formula for who contributes to the fund, and we don't know who qualifies for the funding. And this was the big controversial point, is that least developed countries were pushing for this to be open and equitable for all, where the US and EU were trying to restrict it to the most vulnerable. And I think that is an open question. What will be the criteria for that, and how it will support a just transition? So I'll leave it there, and I'm really excited to hear the rest of the panelists' thoughts on this.
Thank you, Nicholas. Yeah, of course, the loss and damage financing was a fundamental decision that is aligned to the just transition pursuit. But as you rightly say, we still need to think about, there's a lot of work to be done on it. So there were commitments, political commitments, which are all good. But a lot of work remains in terms of, who qualifies for loss and damage. how are we going to define or decide who, the rights of different people to be able to, respond or be able to calculate what has been lost and damaged due to climate change. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done around that area. And within those particular questions about loss and damage, and I invite participants to also reflect on some of these things, because this discussion is going to be big in the next few days or few years. But as we think about that, I want to bring back Kennedy or Ruben. You guys talked about Africa's right to develop and some of those mechanics that we face. In reflecting about the loss and damage framework that came out of COP27, what do you think would be, the best way to look at it, the best way to design it in a way that responds to the needs of the people who have been truly affected by climate change? So maybe Ruben or Kennedy, you could tackle that in a few minutes, 3 minutes or so. Reflect a bit about some of the insights from the book, which I think are critical.
Yes, I think as Kennedy alluded to, the first thing we need to kind of we're trying to highlight, and this is coming out of the book, is that the concept of just transition in Africa really, it's very difficult to separate it from the developmental context around which all these aspects of climate governance are occurring. So even if we're looking at some of the developments that you've seen in the loss and damage mechanisms that have been highlighted under the recently concluded COP, the key issue then becomes, how then do we start to operationalize these mechanisms in a way that complements and facilitates a sort of a rethink or a different pathway to achieving the kind of broader developmental concerns that envelope some of these mechanisms that we are talking about. Also recognizing that these mechanisms, it's still not clear how the loss and damage mechanisms, for example, and so on, are going to really, first of all, be implemented from a global perspective, and two, how they will really start, the extent to which they contribute to implementation of some of Africa's broader developmental policy concerns. And that is where really some of those, the book really comes out to highlight some of these tensions and synergies, and how, first of all, the tensions as to, areas where there's that sort of competing concerns between Africa's very specific priorities and these global goals around which we create these mechanisms, whether under the UNFCCC, under the Paris Agreement, loss and damage mechanism, just transition mechanism, and so on. And so those kind of tensions, but there's also at the same time, there are those synergies that can be created. So these mechanisms can actually help us to not just address climate, but also begin to start rethinking about how, for example, we can merge, say, resilience and loss and damage mechanisms and use that to power or to create this conceptual shift on how we go about achieving development and so on. So this is where the book really comes out, and some of these discussions that you're having here kind of touch on aspects and elements of this sort of big conceptual questions.
Thank you, Robin. Very, very important to get that correct. I want to come back to you, Amanda. In terms of thinking about the mechanisms of loss and damage, because if you think about just transition, loss and damage mechanism is one of those, I think, critical steps that we've achieved in the COP discussions. And with your interactions with the NDCs, what do you think, would be the best mechanisms for the loss and damage framework? How can this be, delivered over and above in a way that is different from adaptation? Are we going to confuse it for adaptation funding or another kind of a loan? Or, I mean, this kind of nuance is still not very clear. But just a reflection from your side. What is the best case scenario for a just transition driven loss and damage funding?
Thanks for this question. And again, it's a really difficult question to answer because again, I think that every country's situation will require and necessitate different things. So simply defining what constitutes loss and damage will actually help to bring more equitable forms of funding that can be distinct from adaptation and try to capture or compensate the irreversible impacts of climate change that can't be addressed through planning or ongoing implementation activities. So I think at the forefront, really these definition issues are going to be really important to ensure that we're including the relevant elements here that aren't being captured through the normal funding and planning and support mechanisms that are out there. Loss and damage overall will really help to ensure a fuller response to a just transition. So I would see this as being very much interlinked, and it captures those whose cultures and livelihoods are forever impacted or lost or reduced because of climate change. So there is this fundamental link there. One thing that I wanted to mention just as an example, and this is going more to the just transition side, but I think some of the elements that come out here are really important in terms of communicating what's important and what can help a country to be successful in some of this request for support that they're looking for. South Africa, it's hard not to point to South Africa as a leading example here, where they went through a holistic national process to consult with local communities, with civil society, business, industry, trade organizations, youth, and of course, government agencies in really determining and setting a vision for just transition in the country. And a few of the elements that made it successful was that it really built on the existing evidence base for transition and the research that had already gone into development planning and sector-specific transition plans and policies that already have implications on just transition. So approaching it not as something new, but really grounding it within the work that's already been done. And perhaps what made this most successful was that it came from the highest level. And it was a priority of the president in unpacking what just transition would look like in the country. So having that high level of political buy-in is critical to enable the success across these different levels and enable different stakeholders to engage effectively in that process. And so this extra effort that went into really ensuring transparency and inclusiveness and accessibility is really fundamental to ensure that the voices were heard and that there's a fuller reflection of how the country sees their needs for a just transition. So if we take this back to the idea of loss and damage, a lot of these ideas, a lot of these imperatives, the best practices can really be carried forward. So again, just really reinforcing and underlying the need to ensure that the right voices are engaged in the discussion, and so that the support that's needed is based on the research that's taking place, but it's also based on the needs and the gaps and supports that really need to be filled.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Amanda. I think all that you say, boils to one question: is who is supposed to benefit from the loss and damage? How do we define who is able to access it? What are their needs? And that is a fundamental question, because when you think about the rights, of different people to be able to, access or to qualify be compensated. How to define that? Because then anyone can say they have the right to be in the private companies and say, okay, we can make profits out of this and help. There are many ways it can go, and we need to begin defining the debate now in terms of the rights. Who has the right? I don't know, Nicholas, you want to comment on that? But I know there are people in the room who have been working on the issues of rights and resilience and climate impact. So, Nicholas, if you want to, use 1 minute to comment on that, as others and participants in the room who are working in the area and are coming in to, respond a bit in terms of the rights, who should really benefit from these mechanisms.
Absolutely. So just quickly, I think the loss and damage mechanism, we don't have many details yet, but what we do know is that the scale of demand is astronomical, right? The amount of damage that is happening right now already is huge. I mean, a dam being broken, like a housing complex being blown down during a hurricane. The scale of that is huge. And the amount of money that is being donated is tiny. Right, so the two don't match yet, and at least on the ambition side, the loss and damage funds need to be much, much bigger. I think we have to be clear that much of this loss and damage is really not about development funding, right? They're not going to be paying for new development initiatives or other things. It's going to be replacing infrastructure, which can have development impacts, but it's more about the justice side than the development side. The last thing I want to point out is that most of the funding that was committed so far at COP is towards the Global Shield, which is a new initiative led by Germany and a few others. That funding is not necessarily part of the loss and damage mechanism, but is supposedly loss and damage. The Global Shield is based on an insurance concept that will help back bigger sort of insurance schemes against disasters and natural disasters and other things. But because of that, it is a question of if insurance should actually be the basis of loss and damage. And it's not clear that should be at the heart of it. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to everyone else's comments.
Good. Insurance discussions and the scale vis-a-vis the reality, very critical. Anybody in the room working on issues of rights, and you want to highlight some ideas on how rights will play in or should play in with regards to the loss and damage, because that is still fundamental for the just transition.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Teller, for giving us this opportunity.
Please introduce yourself properly.
So my name is Alphonse Molo. I'm a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen, University of Nairobi, and also a fellow at ARIN. And I work on issues of rights and resilience, especially within the arid and semi-arid lands in Kenya. 80% of the country is actually falling within that bracket of arid and semi-arid. And just to highlight the complexity we are having when it comes to the triple debate on just transition, rights and resilience, and loss and damage. This particular area is unique in northern Kenya, where it's a lot of pastoralism is taking, agro-pastoralist and pastoralist is taking place. There's the question of just transition in the sense that these are the areas where there are rangelands which are targeted for grazing, but again, there's the competition with either those setting up solar panels or competition from those the wind, those harnessing wind as a form of renewable energy. So the question is, how do we ensure that we benefit these communities within the pastoral areas? Because for them, the rangeland is important. For access to rangeland is important for grazing and for their livelihood. So do we have a situation where we can have a balance in terms of just transition and ensuring that these communities around rangelands are taken into they're benefiting actually, because we are saying we are doing development that is responsive and is benefiting all. And the next thing is on the question again on loss and damage. We know it's about insurance, but now there's this part where, like now, the last 3 years, this particular area, they've lost livestock because of drought, they've lost livestock because of floods, and they've lost livestock because of there was locust invasion, and that also affected part of the stock because there was a lot of aerial spraying. So the question is, how do you compensate, or if it's insurance, then how do you deal with this issue? Do you compensate for livestock loss due to drought, or due to flooding, or due to the aerial spraying that affected the pasture? So these are the questions that we are now grappling with when it comes to this loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Molo. And yeah, the question I was going to put to you as you talk about rights is how do you exactly measure or define or identify those who have the rights to respond to or to benefit from the loss and damage of funding or benefits in very practical terms, just even a case example. And you also free to comment on this. But Molo, from the work, what would that look like? That we want to define a community, a person, an individual, to say this one is truly qualified, to benefit from the loss and damage, funding, and what does that mean in that context?
Yeah, from the perspective of pastoralist, one of the most practical project has been the livestock-based insurance, and it has targeted only those who the people who went for the insurance policy and have been paying for the insurance policy. And within the loss and damage matrix, where the practicality of it is the issue about risk pooling. So insurance comes out as one of it. So then you target individuals who've really picked up a policy on livestock insurance, so the livestock-based insurance index. But increasingly, there's need to create an awareness so that we can get more and more getting enrolled in such schemes. But importantly, it will also be important to get data, real-time data, using either blockchain or other forms of technology to ensure that the larger pastoral, we cover as much as possible. Leave no one behind, that kind of a targeting with the insurance policy. So thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, insurance and all those schemes will be very key. Eva, you want to comment? Okay, you're good. So that's these are key issues that, from what we are seeing is that the just transition is really progressing, positively. We have loss and damage, and as one of those fundamental steps in terms of trying to really practicalize loss and damage. But from what our speakers are mentioning is that the aspect of justice is still, even the loss and damage itself is still very opaque. There's a lot of work to be done. There are options, there are examples that could be pursued, but it depends on really, to what extent are these options really going to speak for the plight of our local communities. Juliet, I don't know whether we have key questions that are on the chat that we can raise at this particular point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tala. I think most of the questions have been responded to on the chat, but I can see just a question coming in and one comment from Sandra Lusaria, who's saying, I think that loss and damage fund should be prioritized to countries who have been affected harshly by adverse effects of climate change. For example, Kenya is currently experiencing a high temperature rise and extreme drought. And also countries like Australia, which have been experiencing consistent breakouts of wild forest fires. So Rosmoen, would you like to unmute and ask your question? All right, I'll read the question from Rose, and she says, my question is, how will the use of loss and damage funds be quantified in relation to the targeted population? And what is the follow-up on the use of funds to ensure that the funds are properly used to address the most affected populations / local communities? I think that's the only question in the chat. Most of the questions have been responded to by the speakers and panelists. Back to you, Dr. Teller.
Thank you very much. I want to therefore give the speakers the final minutes to be able to, speak to their parting shots, and in doing so, try to respond to the question that Juliet has just read. And I think one of the things that would be very critical is for you to try to point us to the way forward. What are the solutions that we need to ensure that the loss and damage in the broader context of just transition works well, for the poor community. So what are those recommendations that need to be taken into account, especially in the African context? So I'll start with you, Iva, if you give your final parting shots, and then I will go to the other speakers as well.
Well, I think I've answered most of the questions, but first of all, I think that the poorest in society are always those who have the weakest spokesman. So there's a special responsibility for governments, but I think also from our part of the world, for development organizations, etc., to support the poorest part of society. But first of all, I think that a common and a strong policy from government to how do they want to change their society, and to stick to the plans, and to take that responsibility for the whole of society, but first of all for the poorest in society, to keep them on board and not let them drown in all the problems that climate change is creating.
Good. So it's a question of strengthening the voices of the poor. Good. Nicholas, what's your final thoughts?
Sure. I think it's around 2 points. The first is this question that Sandra raised about who qualifies for loss and damages. And I mean, your examples are right on. Kenya versus Australia. The question isn't necessarily about vulnerability, because they both are vulnerable to loss and damage. The question is if they can afford, without the help of the international community, to respond to it. And I mean, in designing the new fund, an equity or a just argument is to try to make those who are most or least likely to be able to respond. And that is an open debate. Should it be open to all countries to get funds from the loss and damages, or should it just be sort of the ones who are least able to respond? In a larger picture, I just wanted to say that in some of our research about COP, we can see how African countries are engaging with COP, from in the first one in 1995, just sending 184 delegates, to today spending over 5,000 delegates, right? That's an increase of like 2,000%, right? So there's an engagement with COP at a higher level and in like a stronger way. But even though the capacity to engage in COP and the climate negotiations has changed a lot, it hasn't changed the sort of global political economy of the climate regime, right? The global north still has to cut emissions, and the global south has to adapt, and the global north hasn't made those commitments. So we can see just transitions moving forward, but the larger big picture isn't happening as well. So we can't lose track of both things at the same time. Thank you again for this panel. It's really wonderful.
Excellent. So big question, is it about vulnerability or responsibility? I think that's, Nicholas, what you're putting, and those are the things that are going to shape the next debates. Amanda, I know you are ready to come, but I see participants has raised their hand. Maybe they have a burning question, which you can also address as you mention your final comments. Mary Nantongo,
Thank you very much, Dr.
Shortly.
Taylor. I'm sorry, I dropped out of the call a bit. I don't know if we were wrapping up, because if we were, then I perhaps could put my question on the side. Or no, it was a comment. I came in.
Yeah, you have the floor. You just go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So my name is Mary Nantongo, and I'm a lecturer at the Makerere University Business School in Uganda. So I'd like to bring our discussion to, I think, the first elements that were put across in at the beginning of this discussion, which is the right to development, Africa's right to development. And I think it was quite interesting to me from, I think that was Dr. Mbeva and Dr. Makovere there, who mentioned how important it is for African governments to have a long-term outlook to the issue of transitions. Now, from what I realized from the discussion, I think Africa, we are playing a victim card. The idea that, okay, we have not contributed to climate change much, and we do not have the money, so somebody has to come and somewhat help us through our problem. Of course, and maybe that's also where the discussion about justice comes in, that, you know, somebody should pay for the damage that they have caused. I do not negate that discussion, but I think as Africans, I want us to begin looking at this issue differently. We need to be more, to take a more proactive approach to what we are going to do about our situation regarding the transition. What can we as Africans do to help ourselves out of this situation? Because what I have noticed is that while there's a lot of very good talk at political, convenings and so forth, at convenings like this, in actual sense, in the practicality, at the end of the day, we end up finding ourselves in a situation where people do not give us the money, or if they are to give us the money comes with a lot of strings attached to it. And, we're finding ourselves in this sort of vicious cycle where we are at the receiving end. So then I want us to begin thinking about what is our role in the transition. First of all, ask the question, transition from what to where? Where are we transitioning from as Africa? Where are we currently right now? 90% of our people use fuel wood for cooking. This is what a transition should mean for us in Africa. How do we move our people from cooking with fuel wood to cleaner, more healthy technologies, things like that. The other thing is, currently, as the world progresses to more greener technologies, where are our strengths as Africans? Right now, we know, for example, that there's a huge rush for critical minerals, cobalt, copper, a lot of resources that we have in Africa. And we know that in the past, we have been, finding ourselves in very bad, contracts which do not benefit the African people. So what are our governments doing about giving it a long-term approach of how can we benefit from the transition? I don't believe that anybody is going to give us money. They are going to, first of all, think about their own people and then think about us at the end. There might be a few people maybe who are willing to, but generally human beings, we, you know how things work. So I think as Africans, we need to be very proactive. We need to not think about ourselves as victims, and we need to ask ourselves questions that relate to our real problems and try and find ways of solving them, and not expecting that there's going to be money that's coming from out there to support us. That money might come, but might not be enough. And we need to just really fight our way through this. Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mary. Those are key questions that are fundamental. And I think we cannot address, or these are very heavy and very critical. Thinking about Africa much more strategically. What is our role in all this? Are we just crying? Or what's the investment we are putting in place to ensure that this, we also make a contribution? Transitioning to where? Those are fundamental questions. I want to read another question here, and Amanda, and as you say your final remarks, you'll be able to also perhaps make a comment on that. There's a question from Sandra Lusaria Maloba, which is saying, and this is, I think, directed to Nicholas. So thank you on your thoughts, Nicholas. Okay, no, this is from Lizzie, sorry. There's Lizzie Egbine. I am a farmer and woman leader at my group. We lost our produce to flooding this year. How do we become part of the funding to remedy, to remedy our loss? So people are already asking for the money, so Amanda, as you mentioned your final comments, do you respond to that as well, or any other person? Where are we with this? To respond to some of these urgent needs. And the other comment is on, I think this is for you, Nicholas, on your thoughts on that. Vulnerability and responsibility go hand in hand concerning matters on climate action. So that is very critical that those matrices are taken into account. Amanda, your final comments.
Thank you, and I'll be brief because I completely agree with the insights that were shared by all of the previous speakers here, and especially on this link between vulnerability and responsibility. So the NDC partnership, we include developed countries and developing countries, but really the work is to the benefit of our developing country members. And as has been mentioned, these are the countries who have the least, have contributed the least, and who are the most vulnerable. Does that mean that countries who have not contributed to climate change shouldn't be acting to reduce their emissions? Absolutely not. But it means that we need to look at it from a different perspective, and looking at it from the perspective of development and how the actions on climate change can help the country to learn from the mistakes that have been made in the past, to develop in a way that's clean, that's resilient, but also that's just. So these are the critical issues to really be discussing at these early stages and ensure that it's incorporated into the implementation plans that countries have to address their climate priorities, their climate needs. The other thing that I would mention, and I think this is a really powerful tool that developing countries have at their disposal, is demonstrating what can be done. A small country who doesn't have to do a lot, who puts in place very strong climate policies and very strong commitments, it actually has a very powerful voice at the table in terms of exerting pressure and influence for more to be done. And so that bottom kind of 20% of countries who really contribute very little in terms of climate change, we actually see some really positive and really impressive examples of how they're raising their ambition, how they're improving the quality of their NDCs. And these are examples that we're working to champion and show that there's pressure. And this is helping the bigger countries, the bigger emitters, to understand the needs and to see what their role at the table is as well. So I wanted to just bring that all together, but really would completely second this idea that vulnerability and responsibility really go hand in hand across all of these discussions.
Indeed, vulnerability and responsibility go hand in hand. So where do we go? Do we go to responsibility or do we go to vulnerability in designing the loss and damage funding? Where do we go, Amanda? Where do you lie? Vulnerability or responsibility?
I think that's the question, and there's no clear answer. But again,
Yeah.
it goes to what Mary was saying in terms of how we frame these issues and how we think about them. And so not thinking about it from one perspective or the other. It's not that I'm a vulnerable country and this is what I need, or I'm a responsible country and this is what I need. But really thinking about how they're interlinked and how they can work together.
Yeah. That's conceptually, politically, it's a very hard nut to crack, but let's see how that that's going to go with the discussions on loss and damage. We have a few minutes to end the session, and I want to ask if there's any final burning question. And there is one colleague who works quite closely with, if you want to say practically, with the poor, or a lot of informal settlements in the cities, and he's from Liberia. I don't know, Henry O. Williams, you are the Executive Director of National Disaster Management in Liberia. What are your thoughts, just in terms of speaking to this from the people you work with, from the perspective on, from the experiences that you see on the ground in terms of even our urban and rural settings with regards to some of the disasters that communities face? What are your quick thoughts? Okay, Henry, are you there? Okay, so we are missing that bit of really the practical things. I know researchers have talked, policymakers have talked, but really wanted to get that practical thing. But I want to take this opportunity really to express my gratitude to the panelists and the speakers who have really outlined some of the key issues. I think from the discussions, some of the key points that emerge, are very fundamental. Number one, we all agree that Africa's communities are in need of a just transition. They're not just talking about it. Sometimes they always, talk about it in the streets in terms of advocacies and human rights groups. But, in terms of, conceptualizing and consolidating what we need, that has not been talked about. But we all agree that Africa needs that. But the big questions that are emerging, do we really know as Africa, do we really know what we need in terms of just transition, what will work for the people, especially for the poor? We've heard about the pastoralists, where there are a lot of nuances in terms of who to, benefit. We've heard about responsibility versus vulnerability and what to give a focus. So as a continent, Africa, we need, working with our international partners who are well supporting the knowledge contribution, even in this, platform. We need to begin defining this debate and to clearly say, this is what works and this is what does not work. And we do agree that there are opportunities which are already emerging opportunities such as loss and damage framework. But you can see that today, most African stakeholders, heads of states and many people, there are a lot of excitement that we have loss and damage, but no one is asking the fundamental questions, some of the questions that Dr. Mary has also put across. Beyond this political excitement, what is there for Africa? And how can we, have or take the responsibility of defining this in terms of what, we really need to see in the continent. Indeed, there are a lot of complexities around the issues, issues around rights, issues around, of course, I've talked about responsibility versus vulnerability, issues around, is this funding really realistic? Will it come? How will it come? In what forms? And really, what is the actual contribution of Africa itself to this particular process? So these are things that are worth continuous debate. And from my side, I just want to say it is just, again, always the beginning of these great discussions. And I want to re-emphasize that whenever we have these conversations, we begin to open up our mind. And this is the passion of the Africa Research and Impact Network, that we can already begin to excite or open up people's minds to be able to start thinking around some of these topical issues, not to react, when there's loss and damage, okay, we have it, it's great. We wait again for another COP, how much has been put in place, okay, there is 500 billion or, all that, we get excited again. Who is giving, that kind of trajectory must be rethought for Africa. We must be better prepared. We must have long-term strategies to be able to engage in these processes, because our people need our thinking to go that particular direction. The poor are really waiting. We've talked about really just transition is also about co-creation and profiling the voices of the poor, developing matrices that really capture the voices of the poor. And as Iva put it very well, that really most times the poor or local communities or vulnerable do not have really that, those advocates who are able to clearly, accurately, and adequately represent their voices. So we need to start thinking from within and organize ourselves, look at what is it that we want. Within the NDCs, NDCs are being updated after every periodically, and we have the global stocktake coming. What is it that we is going to be presented as important and fundamental for the continent? So these are discussions I hope that we will continue having. We still have more of this in the conference, and of course we have sessions coming up tomorrow and the following day that will try to look deep into this, especially looking at what are the experiences of local communities. Tomorrow we are looking at really, what are the rights of local communities to link to the just transition agenda, the loss and damage financing. On Friday, we are looking at how can we unpack, how can we decolonize the funding, the policies, the research to really speak to the aspirations of the local community. So this is a very defining moment for Africa, and I hope that we will, jointly work together to be able to contribute something. Even if we don't change something, we can certainly contribute something. I want to again thank our panelists for the insightful comments, and just say that you are wonderful people. You are doing a great contribution to this continent, not just the continent, but the poor voices who are crying for your advocacy, for you to stand for them and to support them in this particular, the situations that they face. At this moment, I want to take back the meeting to Juliet, who will lead us into conclusion. Juliet, ensure that we take a group photo as we end. Back to you, Juliet. Thanks so much. You're muted.
All right, I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much, Dr. Atela, who is also our director, for the very powerful closing remarks. And I can see clapping reactions. Indeed, it is very critical that Africans own up the discussion about just transition, because this is about us, and this is the time where we can use to think about solutions. Let us not ignore our potential to come up with innovative solution, even as we speak about just transition for Africa. I would not wish to repeat myself, but I think we are very honored to have every single one of you join us today. And the discussion does not stop here. Tomorrow from 11 a.m. East African time, we'll be having series of interesting side events, and you can follow our social media pages on Twitter at ARIN_Africa and on Facebook and YouTube at the Africa Research and Impact Network to get more updates about the upcoming sessions during this international conference. Without further ado, please feel very much appreciated from the entire Africa Research and Impact Network fraternity. We look forward to having you yesterday, and please tell a friend to tell a friend, because this is about Africa and Africa is our business. So let's catch up tomorrow and the other day, same time, same place. Just before you leave, would like to take a virtual selfie with each and every one of you. So kindly, you can turn on your cameras and our media team will be on standby to take a photo. So just a minute for that as we wait on you to turn on your cameras. You look really amazing from this end. Thank you very much. All right, so on the count of 3, we are going to be smiling. All right, so 1, 2, and 3. Haran, are we good? Okay, not yet. Just keep smiling, please. Thank you very much. And we are so honored. I mean, I'm out of words, but your presence means a lot for Africa. So let's keep joining these discussions, and please invite your friends, share the links with your friends. We'll be able to send you invites right after this, and we can see you tomorrow. Thank you, and good evening, good night, good day from wherever you joined us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.